Hey guys, medieval work is often imagined as simple, slow, and strangely peaceful. People in fields, church bells in the distance, a village moving at the pace of the seasons. But for many ordinary people, the medieval working day was not peaceful at all. It was a world of aching joints, poor sleep, cold mornings, hunger, obligation, and tasks that never quite ended. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, liking the video is a simple way to support it. And if you want more calm, quietly fascinating history for evenings, sleep, or background listening, consider subscribing. So tonight, let's step gently into the working lives of medieval people, not to mock them, romanticize them, or reduce them to misery, but to understand why exhaustion was not an accident of their world. It was built into the rhythm of the land, the economy, the body, the weather, and the social order itself. The first thing to understand is that medieval work was rarely separated from life in the way modern people often imagine. Today, many people think of work as something that begins at a certain hour, ends at another, and belongs to a particular place. Even when modern work becomes overwhelming, there is usually at least the idea of a boundary. In the medieval village, especially for peasants and laboring families, that boundary was much weaker. Work was not merely employment. It was survival. A household did not simply earn money and then buy what it needed. It produced, repaired, gathered, stored, carried, cooked, spun, mended, tended, and endured. The work of living was stitched into every hour. A field had to be weeded. Animals had to be fed. Firewood had to be collected. Water had to be carried. Grain had to be ground. Clothing had to be patched. Children had to be watched. Tools had to be maintained. Food had to be preserved before it spoiled. Nothing waited politely for a free afternoon. And because so much of this labor was physical, exhaustion accumulated in the body long before anyone described it in modern medical language. A medieval peasant waking before dawn did not rise into comfort. The air inside the home could be smoky, damp, and cold. The floor might be packed earth. Bedding was often simple, shared, and alive with the ordinary discomforts of a world without modern sanitation. Sleep itself was not always a deep, uninterrupted escape. Animals, infants, cold, hunger, insects, illness, and fear could all break the night into fragments. Then came morning. The body that rose from that bed was already carrying yesterday's labor. Hands were stiff, backs were sore, feet were often poorly protected. Clothing was practical, heavy when wet, and not always fully dry from the day before. The first tasks might begin before the sun had properly lifted. Stirring embers, preparing food, checking animals, fetching water, opening the day's work before the larger labor even began. This is where one of the first misunderstandings appears. People sometimes hear that medieval peasants had many holy days and imagine a surprisingly relaxed life. And it is true that the medieval calendar included feast days, church festivals, and periods when certain kinds of labor slowed or stopped. But this does not mean life was leisurely in the modern sense. A day without plowing was not necessarily a day without work. Animals still needed care. Food still had to be prepared. Water still had to be carried. Children did not pause because it was a saint's day. Hunger did not wait outside the door until the festival ended. And even when work stopped publicly, the private labor of the household continued quietly. In much of medieval Europe, the heaviest work followed the agricultural year. The rhythm was seasonal, but seasonal did not mean gentle. It meant that certain months were punishingly intense, because a missed window could become a failed harvest, and a failed harvest could become hunger. Plowing demanded strength from people and animals alike. The soil could be heavy, wet, resistant. A plow was not a smooth machine gliding through perfect earth. It was a tool dragged through a living, uneven, stubborn landscape. Oxen or horses strained. Men guided. Others broke clods, cleared stones, repaired harness, and watched the sky. The sky mattered more than almost anything. Rain at the wrong time could ruin hay. Frost could damage growth. A dry spell could threaten grain. Too much wet could rot what should have ripened. The medieval worker did not merely work hard. He worked under uncertainty. The weather was not background scenery. It was a force that could undo months of effort without warning. This constant uncertainty deepened exhaustion, because labor was not only physical. It was anxious. A family could do everything expected of them and still lose. They could rise early, work honestly, obey obligations, plant carefully, harvest when called, and still face scarcity because the season turned against them. Medieval work also took place inside a social structure that claimed portions of a person's energy before that person could work for themselves. For many peasants, especially those bound to a manor, labor obligations were owed to a lord. This could mean working the lord's domain lands for part of the week, giving time and strength that might otherwise have gone to the family's own strips of land. The details varied widely by place and century, and medieval Europe was never one simple system. But the broad pressure was familiar. Ordinary people often owed not only rent or produce, but labor itself. That matters because exhaustion is not just about the total number of hours worked. It is also about control. Work feels different when the timing is yours. It feels different when the best weather day must be spent on someone else's field while your own crop waits. It feels different when the same body must serve obligation first and survival second. In that quiet contradiction, much of medieval fatigue becomes easier to understand. A peasant household might need to balance lordly demands, church dues, village expectations, seasonal urgency, household needs, and simple bodily limits. No single task explains the exhaustion. The exhaustion came from the layering, and the layering rarely stopped. During harvest, the pressure could become almost total. Harvest was the moment when the year's hope became visible, but it was also the moment when failure could still arrive. Grain had to be cut, gathered, carried, dried, stored, guarded, and processed. The work was repetitive, stooping, urgent. Hands handled stalks until skin roughened and split. Backs bent again and again. Dust filled the nose and throat. Heat could press down during the day. Damp could threaten at night. There was a strange cruelty in harvest labor. The better the crop, the more work it demanded. Abundance did not mean rest. It meant urgency. A field ready for cutting did not care whether the workers were already tired. If rain came before the grain was safely gathered, the year's food could suffer. So people pushed past ordinary limits because the crop could not be rescheduled. This is one reason medieval exhaustion was so closely tied to time. Not clock time in the modern industrial sense, but natural time. Dawn, dusk, weather, ripeness, frost, daylight, animal strength, church bells, and customary duty all shaped the day. The worker was surrounded by time pressures, even without a factory whistle. And yet, the medieval day was not always organized with the rigid precision of later industrial labor. That is another important nuance. Medieval people were not factory workers in a pre-machine world. Their labor could be irregular, seasonal, and flexible in some ways. There were pauses, communal moments, feast days, winter slowdowns, and tasks that shifted with conditions. But flexibility did not automatically mean ease. A flexible burden is still a burden. Winter might reduce certain field tasks, but it brought its own forms of labor and discomfort. Firewood became essential. Animals had to be kept alive. Stored food had to last. Clothing and tools needed repair. Darkness lengthened. Cold entered the bones. Illness moved more easily through crowded homes. If the harvest had been poor, winter was not a quiet season of rest, but a long negotiation with hunger. For women, the exhaustion of medieval work was often especially continuous because so much of their labor was hidden inside the household economy. A man's field labor might be visible in the village landscape. A woman's labor could be everywhere and nowhere at once. Baking, brewing, spinning, washing, nursing, gardening, tending animals, preparing meals, preserving food, managing children, assisting in fields during peak seasons, and maintaining the fragile domestic systems that made survival possible. Spinning alone could consume enormous amounts of time. Before cloth became clothing, fiber had to be processed, spun into thread, woven, cut, sewn, and repaired. The simple existence of a shirt represented hours upon hours of labor. A torn garment was not a small inconvenience. It was a demand on someone's time, eyesight, fingers, and patience. This is where modern viewers can easily underestimate the medieval world. We are used to objects arriving finished. Medieval people lived among objects that had to be coaxed into usefulness and then kept useful for as long as possible. A pot, a blade, a shoe, a tunic, a fence, a roof, a rope, each belonged to a chain of labor. Each could fail. Each failure created more work. Even food was not simple. Bread, the foundation of much medieval diet, carried a long history of effort before it reached the mouth. Grain had to be grown, harvested, threshed, winnowed, stored, transported, ground, mixed, kneaded, baked. If a household used a lord's mill or oven, there could be fees and obligations attached. If fuel was scarce, baking itself required planning. Bread was ordinary, but ordinary did not mean easy. And this is one of the quiet truths of medieval exhaustion. The most tiring parts of life were often the most normal. No one looked at carrying water as a dramatic event. It was simply what had to be done. No one treated gathering fuel as a heroic achievement. It was part of the day. No one considered mending clothing a great historical moment. Yet these repeated acts shaped the texture of existence more than battles or coronations ever did for most people. The body, meanwhile, had fewer protections. A small injury could become a lasting problem. A twisted ankle during harvest, a cut from a tool, a strain from lifting, an infection from dirty conditions. Any of these could threaten not only comfort, but a family's ability to keep working. Rest was not always available as a cure because survival demanded motion. Pain was often absorbed into routine. That does not mean medieval people were constantly miserable in a simplistic way. They laughed, celebrated, formed communities, loved their children, marked festivals, told stories, sang while working, and found meaning in religious rhythms and local ties. A trustworthy history has to hold both truths at once. Medieval life could be deeply communal and spiritually rich, and it could also be physically punishing. These are not opposites. They lived beside each other. In fact, community was sometimes one of the ways exhaustion became bearable. Harvest might draw many hands together. Neighbors helped one another. Work songs could set pace. Shared meals could soften hardship. Religious festivals could bring color into a life of mud, smoke, and muscle. The same village that imposed expectations could also provide support. But community also created pressure. Everyone knew who worked, who failed, who owed, who struggled, who borrowed, who fell behind. In a small medieval community, privacy was limited. Reputation mattered. Survival depended on relationships. A person could not simply disappear from the social world after a difficult day. They lived within a web of mutual aid, obligation, judgment, and memory. And above this village world stood institutions that shaped labor in ways both practical and symbolic. The church structured time through bells, feast days, fasts, rituals, and moral teachings about work. Labor was not merely economic. It had spiritual meaning. Idleness could be condemned. Duty could be sanctified. Suffering could be interpreted through religion. The working body was not only tired, it was placed inside a universe of sin, salvation, humility, and divine order. For modern viewers, this can feel difficult to grasp. Today, exhaustion is often described through productivity, stress, burnout, or work-life balance. In the medieval imagination, tiredness might be understood through the fall of humanity, through penance, through the duty of one's station, or through the ordinary burden of earthly life. That belief did not make the back hurt less, but it changed the way people made sense of the pain. At the same time, the medieval elite depended on the labor of those below them while often describing society as a harmonious order. One group prayed, one group fought, one group worked. This famous three-part image of medieval society was never the whole reality, but it reveals something important. Laboring people were seen as necessary, even divinely placed, yet their necessity did not free them from exploitation. The worker was essential and subordinate at the same time. That contradiction sat quietly beneath the fields, the mills, the roads, and the manor courts. Without peasant labor, the Lord's table would empty. Without women's domestic labor, households would collapse. Without craftsmen, towns could not function. Without carters, porters, bakers, brewers, smiths, masons, shepherds, and servants, medieval society would lose its shape. Yet the people who carried this world often had the least freedom to step away from it. And when towns grew, exhaustion did not disappear. Changed form. Urban work in the medieval period could be just as demanding, though in different ways. A town promised opportunity, wages, markets, guilds, and movement. It also brought noise, cramped housing, smoke, waste, disease, long apprenticeships, strict rules, and relentless hand labor. The medieval town was not an escape from exhaustion. It was another machine, made not of engines, but of bodies, tools, deadlines, and crowded streets. A baker rose in darkness. A smith worked in heat. A fuller handled foul substances in the processing of cloth. A mason lifted, shaped, and set stone. A servant answered to another household's rhythm. An apprentice might sleep near the workshop and live under the authority of a master. Work and discipline were woven tightly together. And in towns, time began to feel different. Markets opened. Bells rang. Guild regulations mattered. Customers waited. Materials had to arrive. Payments had to be made. Reputation could determine survival. The urban worker might not be tied to a field, but he or she was tied to demand, skill, hierarchy, and the constant need to keep producing. Here again, something that looks like progress from a distance could feel exhausting up close. Towns created choice, but also competition. They offered wages, but demanded reliability. They allowed craft specialization, but often required years of training under hard conditions. They generated wealth, but also displayed inequality more sharply. A medieval town at night might look beautiful to us in imagination, with lanterns, timbered houses, church towers, and narrow streets. But for the people inside it, beauty was mixed with smell, labor, risk, and fatigue. And the fatigue began early in life. Childhood in the medieval world was not simply a miniature version of modern childhood. Children were loved, but they were also useful. As they grew, they helped. They watched animals, gathered sticks, fetched water, assisted in fields, learned crafts, cared for younger siblings, carried messages, and absorbed the work rhythms of adults long before they reached full strength. By the time many people became adults, work was not a new burden. It was the world they had always known. This early training made medieval people skilled in ways modern people often overlook. They understood animals, weather signs, tools, soil, household economies, craft processes, local paths, seasonal dangers, and social obligations. Their knowledge was practical, embodied, and often inherited. But skill did not erase strain. Sometimes it simply allowed people to endure more efficiently. And endurance was perhaps the central skill of medieval labor. Not speed, not ambition, not personal fulfillment in the modern sense, but endurance. The ability to repeat, to adjust, to survive uncertainty, to keep working when conditions were poor, to accept discomfort as ordinary, to carry one season into the next. This brings us to a quieter question. What did rest mean in such a world? Rest existed, of course. People slept, paused, celebrated, prayed, sat by fires, shared ale, attended festivals, and marked sacred time. But rest was shaped by dependency. A day of rest could be interrupted by necessity. A festival could be shadowed by debt. A winter evening could be softened by storytelling but sharpened by hunger. Rest was not always freedom. Sometimes it was simply the space between demands. And even sacred rest had boundaries. The medieval calendar might protect certain days from certain labors, but it did not suspend the needs of bodies, animals, infants, ovens, fires, and weather. The cow still needed milking. The child still cried. The cold still entered. The stomach still asked. So when we ask why medieval work left people constantly exhausted, the answer is not merely that they worked long hours. That answer is too simple. They were exhausted because life itself required an unbroken chain of labor, because survival depended on physical effort, because social obligations claimed their time, because tools were limited, because weather was powerful, because illness and injury were dangerous, because rest was fragile, and because almost every object and meal carried hidden work inside it. And yet, to understand this fully, we have to go deeper still, beyond the visible labor of fields and workshops, into the systems that decided who owed work, who controlled time, who benefited from exhaustion, and why even moments of relief could quietly reinforce the very order that made people so tired. And yet, to understand this fully, we have to go deeper still, beyond the visible labor of fields and workshops, into the systems that decided who owed work, who controlled time, who benefited from exhaustion, and why even moments of relief could quietly reinforce the very order that made people so tired. One of the easiest mistakes to make when looking back at the medieval world is to imagine exhaustion as a purely personal experience. We often think of tiredness as belonging to an individual body. Someone works too much, sleeps too little, and eventually becomes exhausted. But medieval fatigue was often woven into institutions. It was not merely something that happened to people. In many ways, it was something that society continuously produced. To see this more clearly, it helps to imagine a village not as a collection of separate households, but as a network of obligations. Every family stood inside multiple layers of responsibility. There were duties owed to the manor. There were expectations imposed by the village community. There were religious obligations tied to the church. There were family obligations stretching across generations. There were customary rights and customary burdens. And beneath all of these lay the constant demand of survival itself. A modern worker may complain that there are not enough hours in the day. Medieval people often faced a similar reality, but for different reasons. The problem was not usually a crowded calendar filled with appointments. It was that every layer of life demanded labor, and almost none of those layers could be ignored without consequences. The manor offers a useful example. In many regions of medieval Europe, peasants did not simply live on land. They lived within legal and economic relationships that shaped what they could do with that land. Historians often debate the details because conditions varied enormously from place to place. A village in 13th century England was not identical to one in northern France or the Holy Roman Empire. Even neighboring manors could differ significantly, yet a common pattern emerges. Those who worked the land often did so under obligations that limited their freedom. A peasant might owe labor services, rents, fees, or a portion of agricultural production. Certain facilities, such as mills or ovens, could be subject to lordly control. Some peasants possessed more independence than others. Some accumulated property and influence. Others lived much closer to the edge of survival. But regardless of these differences, the relationship itself mattered. Every hour spent fulfilling an obligation was an hour unavailable for another task. This is where medieval exhaustion begins to reveal a deeper logic. Labor was not only physically demanding, it was frequently fragmented. Imagine a week during an important agricultural season. Your own crops need attention. Weeds are spreading. The weather forecast does not exist, but dark clouds suggest change. Harvest is approaching. Tools require maintenance. Livestock must be monitored. At the same time, labor is owed elsewhere. The body cannot divide itself. Every obligation competes for the same muscles, the same daylight, the same limited reserves of energy. The result is not simply hard work. The result is pressure. Pressure is one of the least visible features of medieval life, yet it appears almost everywhere once you begin looking for it. Pressure from weather, pressure from obligation, pressure from scarcity, pressure from social expectations, pressure from uncertainty. Many modern viewers imagine exhaustion as something caused by speed. Medieval exhaustion was often caused by vulnerability. The difference is important. A factory worker in the 19th century might face relentless pace. A modern office worker might face relentless communication. A medieval peasant frequently faced relentless uncertainty. A bad season could undo months of effort. An illness could remove a crucial worker from the household. A dead ox might represent disaster. A failed harvest could echo through an entire year. The energy required to live under such conditions was not only physical. It was psychological, even if medieval people would not have described it using modern language. They worried. They planned. They calculated. They hoped. They feared. Not necessarily every moment of every day, but often enough that uncertainty became part of the landscape itself. Interestingly, this uncertainty also explains why certain customs that seem restrictive to modern observers sometimes persisted for centuries. Communal field systems provide a useful example. In many medieval regions, agricultural land was divided into strips spread across larger open fields. To modernize, this arrangement can seem inefficient. Why scatter a family's holdings across multiple locations? Yet, from the perspective of risk management, the system offered advantages. Different strips might experience slightly different conditions. One section could perform poorly while another performed better. Risks were distributed. Communities coordinated planting and harvesting together. Individual freedom was limited, but vulnerability was shared. This reveals a recurring theme in medieval history. Practices that appear irrational from a modern perspective often emerge as practical responses to difficult circumstances. The same principle appears in labor itself. Many forms of work that seem exhausting beyond reason were not maintained because people enjoyed suffering. They were maintained because alternatives were limited. Consider the simple act of grinding grain. Today, flour appears almost magically in shops and supermarkets. The process is invisible to most consumers. In the medieval world, grain processing represented an enormous investment of time and energy. Hand grinding was exhausting. Mill technology offered relief, but access to mills could involve fees, obligations, or travel. Even improvements that reduced labor often created new dependencies. A watermill might save effort, but it could also strengthen the authority of whoever controlled it. This pattern appears again and again throughout medieval society. Labor-saving solutions existed, but labor-saving did not always mean freedom. Sometimes it simply shifted power. A lord's mill could reduce physical strain while increasing economic dependence. A guild could protect craftsmen while restricting competition. A village custom could provide security while limiting personal choice. The medieval world rarely offered simple trade-offs. Instead, people navigated systems in which every advantage carried obligations of its own. This complexity becomes especially clear when we look at the lives of craftsmen. At first glance, skilled urban workers might appear far removed from the hardships of agricultural labor. A blacksmith was not harvesting grain. A carpenter was not driving a plow through wet soil. Yet craft labor brought different forms of exhaustion. Skill required repetition. Repetition required discipline. Discipline required time. An apprentice entering a trade could spend years learning techniques that modern machinery now performs automatically. The process was physically demanding, but it was also mentally demanding. Mistakes wasted materials. Materials cost money. Money was often scarce. A careless error could affect a workshop's reputation. And reputation in many towns was nearly as valuable as the products themselves. This is one reason medieval towns often regulated work so carefully. Guilds established standards. They monitored quality. They controlled training. They protected economic interests. Modern observers sometimes view these regulations as restrictive. In many ways they were. Yet they also emerged from a world where trust mattered enormously. A customer purchasing shoes, tools, cloth, or metal goods could not rely on modern consumer protections. Quality depended heavily on reputation, and maintaining that reputation required constant effort. The result was another form of fatigue. Not the fatigue of harvest fields, but the fatigue of responsibility. A master craftsman carried the burden of production, training, business relationships, and household management simultaneously. Work did not end when the workshop closed, because the workshop was often the household. This blending of home and labor is another feature of medieval life that modern viewers frequently underestimate. Today, many people physically leave work behind at the end of the day. Medieval workers often lived where they worked. The forge stood beside the home. The workshop occupied the lower floor. The family participated in production. Children learned skills by observation. Meals occurred in spaces connected directly to labor. Work and domestic life flowed into one another so completely that separating them becomes difficult. The same room might witness commerce in the morning, tool repair in the afternoon, and family life in the evening. There was comfort in this arrangement. There was also no escape from it. The boundaries that modern people rely upon for recovery simply existed in different forms. And recovery mattered because the medieval body aged under heavy demands. A particularly revealing aspect of medieval labor history is the evidence of wear found in human remains. Archaeologists studying skeletons frequently encounter signs of repetitive strain, arthritis, joint degeneration, healed injuries, and chronic physical stress. Of course, bones cannot tell us everything. They do not reveal every thought or emotion, but they do preserve traces of effort. The body remembers labor long after the worker is gone. A bent spine, a damaged knee, a worn shoulder joint. These marks remind us that exhaustion was not always temporary. For many people, it accumulated over decades. The medieval laborer often carried the memory of work within the body itself. Yet even here, there is an important nuance. People were not passive victims of hardship. They adapted. Human beings are remarkably skilled at adapting. Workers developed techniques. Communities shared knowledge. Tools improved gradually. Experience reduced mistakes. Traditions preserved practical wisdom. A seasoned plowman understood soil differently from a novice. An experienced shepherd noticed subtle signs in animals. A skilled spinner moved with efficiency learned over thousands of hours. Knowledge softened some burdens, even when it could not remove them entirely. And this practical knowledge represented a form of wealth that is easy to overlook today. Many medieval people possessed extraordinary expertise in tasks that modern societies rarely require. They understood seasons with remarkable precision. They recognized weather patterns. They managed resources carefully because waste carried real consequences. They repaired rather than replaced. They reused rather than discarded. They extracted value from materials that modern consumers might throw away without a second thought. In some respects, this expertise made life more manageable. In others, it revealed just how much labor was required to sustain ordinary existence. A modern household can solve many problems with a purchase. A medieval household often solved problems with work. When something broke, someone repaired it. When supplies ran low, someone gathered more. When clothing wore out, someone patched it. When food needed preserving, someone spent hours preparing it. The solution to many challenges was not consumption. It was labor, and labor demanded energy. This helps explain another paradox. Medieval people could be highly productive without necessarily feeling secure. They worked constantly because constant work was often necessary to maintain stability. Security was not achieved once and then enjoyed indefinitely. It had to be renewed again and again through effort. Every season restarted the process. Every harvest reopened the question. Every winter tested the answer. And as the centuries moved forward, larger forces began placing new pressures upon these already demanding lives. Population growth altered land availability. Markets expanded. Trade networks grew. Towns became more important. Economic opportunities increased for some while narrowing for others. The world of medieval labor was never static. It was changing, sometimes gradually and sometimes dramatically, and those changes would eventually expose a contradiction that had been quietly building beneath the surface of medieval society for generations. A contradiction between the growing demands placed upon ordinary workers and the limits of what their bodies, their communities, and their traditional systems could continue to bear as Europe moved toward one of the most transformative periods in its history. And those changes would eventually expose a contradiction that had been quietly building beneath the surface of medieval society for generations, a contradiction between the growing demands placed upon ordinary workers and the limits of what their bodies, their communities, and their traditional systems could continue to bear as Europe moved toward one of the most transformative periods in its history. For much of the medieval era, population growth was often seen as a sign of success. More people meant more hands available for work, more land brought into cultivation, more villages, more markets, and greater economic activity. During long stretches of the High Middle Ages, particularly between the 11th and early 14th centuries, many regions experienced significant expansion. Forests were cleared, marshes were drained, new settlements appeared in places that earlier generations had considered marginal. From a distance, this can look like a story of progress. And in some respects, it was. Agricultural production increased. Trade expanded. Towns became more active. Cathedrals rose over growing urban centers. Merchants connected distant regions. New technologies slowly spread. Watermills multiplied. Windmills appeared in more places. Improved plow designs helped farmers cultivate heavier soils. Yet growth brought its own pressures. A family living in a sparsely populated landscape has access to different opportunities than a family living where every productive piece of land is already claimed. As populations increased, the balance between people and resources began to change. Land became more valuable. Inheritance became more complicated. Opportunities became more uneven. The exhaustion that resulted was not always the exhaustion of harder labor. Sometimes it was the exhaustion of tighter margins. Imagine a peasant family several generations removed from the founding of a village. The original settlers may have enjoyed access to relatively generous plots. Over time, as children inherited and families expanded, holdings could become fragmented. What had once supported one household might eventually need to support several. The soil itself did not become less demanding simply because more people depended upon it. In some areas, cultivation pushed into less fertile land. Hillsides, poorer soils, and difficult terrain entered production because population growth left few alternatives. These lands could produce food, but often at higher cost and greater risk. Once again, a recurring theme emerges. The medieval world frequently responded to challenges not by reducing labor, but by increasing it. If good land was scarce, more effort was invested in marginal land. If food was limited, more labor was required to secure it. If resources became strained, households worked harder to compensate. This pattern helps explain why many people remained exhausted even during periods of economic growth. Growth did not necessarily translate into comfort. Sometimes it simply created new demands. At the same time, the expansion of trade networks introduced another subtle transformation. The village economy was never completely isolated. Medieval villages bought, sold, exchanged, borrowed, and interacted with wider markets. But as commercial activity increased, more people became connected to economic forces beyond their immediate surroundings. A poor harvest in one region could affect prices elsewhere. Demand for wool could influence land use. Urban growth could reshape rural priorities. The ordinary laborer often had little control over these larger developments, yet their consequences reached directly into daily life. This is particularly visible in areas where wool production expanded. The medieval wool trade became one of the most significant economic activities in parts of Europe. Demand for woolen cloth created opportunities for profit. Landowners noticed, merchants noticed, governments noticed, and when powerful people noticed profit, labor patterns often changed. Pastures expanded in some areas. Agricultural priorities shifted. Communities adapted to market incentives. For workers, these changes could create opportunities but also insecurity. A growing economy is rarely experienced equally. Some individuals prospered. Others found themselves navigating new uncertainties. The important point is that exhaustion remained a constant companion because economic growth did not remove the underlying vulnerability of life. The weather still mattered. Disease still mattered. Crop failure still mattered. Physical labor still mattered. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in the relationship between food and work. Modern industrial societies often separate food production from everyday consciousness. Most people never witness the growing, harvesting, processing, transporting, and storing of the food they consume. Medieval people lived much closer to those realities. They understood instinctively that food represented labor transformed into survival. Every loaf of bread contained countless hours of effort. Every meal reflected successful coordination between weather, land, tools, animals, and human bodies. This relationship created a powerful psychological effect. Food was rarely taken for granted. The fear of scarcity remained close, even during good years. And scarcity was not merely an abstract possibility. Throughout medieval history, harvest failures periodically reminded entire populations of how fragile stability could be. A sequence of poor harvests could produce consequences that reached far beyond empty stomachs. Prices rose, debt increased, migration accelerated, social tensions intensified, health deteriorated. The body that was already tired became weaker still. One reason medieval exhaustion can be difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate is that many of its causes reinforced one another. Poor nutrition reduced strength. Reduced strength made labor harder. Hard labor increased fatigue. Fatigue made illness more dangerous. Illness reduced productivity. Reduced productivity threatened food supplies. The cycle could become self-perpetuating. This does not mean medieval people lived in permanent crisis. Most years were not catastrophic. Most communities functioned. Families adapted. Life continued. But the possibility of disruption never disappeared. And because it never disappeared, people devoted enormous energy to preventing it. In a sense, much medieval labor was defensive. Workers were not always striving for abundance. Often they were striving to avoid disaster. There is an important emotional difference between those goals. Working toward abundance can feel hopeful. Working to prevent catastrophe can feel exhausting. Many medieval households spent much of their lives performing the latter. This becomes especially apparent when we consider storage. Storage rarely appears in popular depictions of medieval life. It lacks the visual drama of castles, battles, or royal ceremonies. Yet storage was absolutely essential. Grain had to survive months. Fuel had to last through winter. Preserved foods had to remain edible. Seeds had to be protected for future planting. A mistake made during storage could destroy the value of months of labor. Rodents, moisture, mold, theft, insects, and simple bad luck all pose threats. The work of preserving resources never truly ended. In many ways, medieval society was engaged in a constant struggle against loss. Loss of food, loss of labor, loss of tools, loss of animals, loss of health. The effort required to resist these losses shaped everyday life. It also shaped attitudes toward work itself. Modern culture often celebrates innovation, disruption, and transformation. Medieval communities frequently valued reliability. Reliability kept people alive. A dependable worker mattered. A dependable harvest mattered. A dependable neighbor mattered. A dependable animal mattered. Predictability carried enormous value in an unpredictable world. This helps explain why medieval societies could appear conservative to modern observers. Traditions persisted because they had demonstrated usefulness. Customs survived because they reduced uncertainty. Methods were repeated because failure carried serious consequences. The result was a world in which change occurred, but often gradually. People experimented, adapted, and improved. Yet they also respected inherited knowledge because inherited knowledge had been tested repeatedly by survival itself. Even so, change could not be held back forever. By the early 14th century, Europe had become more densely populated than it had been for centuries. Agricultural systems were under increasing pressure. Marginal lands were being cultivated. Communities were larger. Economic networks were more interconnected. At first glance, the medieval world appeared strong. Cathedrals towered over cities. Markets bustled. Trade routes connected regions. Universities flourished. Kings expanded authority. Merchants accumulated wealth. Yet beneath this impressive surface, strains were beginning to emerge. The system was productive, but it was also stretched. And stretched systems are often vulnerable to shocks. The people living at the time could not see the future. They did not know that some of the assumptions supporting daily life would soon be tested in extraordinary ways. What they experienced instead was a gradual tightening. Small signs, unfavorable weather, local shortages, rising pressures on land, growing competition for resources, the kind of developments that seem manageable individually but become significant when combined. This is one of history's most fascinating patterns. Major transformations often begin quietly, not with a single dramatic event, not with an obvious turning point, but with accumulating pressures that slowly change the balance of a system. For ordinary workers, these pressures often translated into additional labor. If harvests became less reliable, more effort was required. If resources became scarcer, more work was necessary. If opportunities narrowed, families adapted through greater diligence and sacrifice. The body remained the primary tool available to solve many problems. And when the body is the primary tool, exhaustion becomes a recurring cost. Yet the medieval worker was not merely a victim of circumstance. Many households demonstrated remarkable resilience. Communities developed strategies for mutual support. Village institutions evolved to manage risk. Religious organizations provided assistance in some circumstances. Families pooled resources. Neighbors shared labor. The medieval world survived because cooperation often balanced hardship. This cooperative dimension is sometimes overlooked in modern discussions of labor. People endured not only because they worked, but because they worked together. Harvest teams, shared plowing arrangements, collective grazing systems, mutual aid during illness, communal maintenance of infrastructure. These forms of cooperation reduced individual burdens, even while creating obligations of their own. And obligations once again occupy a central place in the story, because cooperation was never entirely voluntary. The same community that provided support could also enforce expectations. A neighbor might help during hardship today and expect assistance tomorrow. A village could offer protection while demanding conformity. Belonging brought benefits. Belonging also carried costs. The balance between those two realities shaped countless lives. And as the 14th century approached, that balance would be tested more severely than most people could imagine. Not all at once, not through a single disaster, but through a series of developments that would expose weaknesses hidden beneath centuries of hard work, adaptation, and endurance. For generations, medieval workers had accepted exhaustion as part of life because the system around them seemed permanent. Lords ruled, villages endured, fields produced crops, seasons returned, obligations continued. The structure felt ancient, stable, almost natural. Yet history often reserves its greatest surprises for systems that appear most secure. And in the years ahead, the relationship between labor, exhaustion, survival, and power would begin to shift in ways that neither peasants nor nobles fully anticipated. As Europe moved toward a period when the value of work itself would be questioned, renegotiated, and transformed by forces already gathering beyond the horizon. And in the years ahead, the relationship between labor, exhaustion, survival, and power would begin to shift in ways that neither peasants nor nobles fully anticipated. As Europe moved toward a period when the value of work itself would be questioned, renegotiated, and transformed by forces already gathering beyond the horizon. At first, however, those forces did not announce themselves dramatically. The medieval worker waking before dawn in the early 14th century could not see history approaching. The fields still needed attention. The animals still required care. The familiar obligations of daily life remained intact. Church bells continued to mark the passage of time. Manor courts still functioned. Markets still operated. From the perspective of ordinary experience, continuity often appears stronger than change. This is one reason historical transformations can be difficult to recognize while they are happening. People live through individual days, not historical eras. A peasant worried about this year's grain harvest is rarely thinking about the long-term evolution of labor systems. A blacksmith concerned about fuel costs is not usually contemplating the future structure of European society. Most people experience history through practical problems, and practical problems were becoming more common. One of the most important developments was environmental instability. For generations, many regions of Europe had benefited from relatively favorable climatic conditions. Historians sometimes refer to this period as part of the medieval warm period, though the reality was complex and varied across locations. What matters for our story is that weather patterns began to shift. The changes were not uniform. They were not immediately obvious everywhere, but they mattered. Cooler temperatures, increased rainfall in some regions, and greater climatic unpredictability gradually affected agricultural productivity. For societies heavily dependent upon farming, even modest environmental changes could carry enormous consequences. Modern economies possess buffers. Food can be transported over vast distances. Technology can compensate for certain environmental challenges. Governments maintain reserves. Markets adjust. Medieval communities possessed far fewer protections. A poor harvest remained a deeply serious event. And when poor harvests occurred repeatedly, exhaustion deepened into something more dangerous. The years between 1315 and 1317 provide a striking example. Across large parts of northern Europe, unusually heavy rains damaged crops, disrupted agriculture, and created severe food shortages. This crisis is often called the Great Famine. The name itself can sound distant and abstract, but for ordinary people it was intensely physical. Fields became waterlogged, harvests failed, stored supplies dwindled, food prices increased dramatically, livestock suffered. Communities faced choices that would have been unthinkable during better years. The significance of the Great Famine is not merely that people went hungry. Hunger magnified every existing difficulty. The laborer who already worked long hours now worked with reduced strength. The mother responsible for feeding a household faced impossible calculations. The craftsman purchasing food found that wages stretched less far. Physical exhaustion became inseparable from nutritional exhaustion. The body needs energy to work. When food becomes scarce, the body's capacity to perform labor declines. Yet the need for labor does not disappear. In fact, crises often demand more work. Repairs must still be completed. Animals still require care. Communities still need food. The result is a cruel contradiction. People must work harder precisely when they are least capable of doing so. Accounts from the period reveal widespread suffering. Contemporary chroniclers described hunger, desperation, disease, and social disruption. As always, historians approach such accounts carefully. Medieval writers sometimes exaggerated or emphasized dramatic details. Yet even allowing for exaggeration, the broader picture is unmistakable. The famine represented a major shock to a society already operating close to its limits. And it revealed something important about medieval exhaustion. Many people had been surviving successfully, but only within a relatively narrow margin of safety. When environmental conditions deteriorated, those margins disappeared quickly. This does not mean medieval society was weak. In many respects, it was remarkably resilient. Communities adapted. Families shared resources. Institutions attempted relief efforts. People found ways to endure. But resilience is not the same as comfort. Resilience often requires extraordinary effort. An extraordinary effort leaves traces. Imagine a farming household during those difficult years. The work remains. The obligations remain. The uncertainty increases. Meals become smaller. Strength declines. An illness that might have been manageable becomes more dangerous. Every task feels heavier. Every journey feels longer. Every decision carries greater weight. The exhaustion of such a household cannot be measured simply by hours worked. It is a deeper form of fatigue, the fatigue of persistent insecurity. Yet even the Great Famine, devastating as it was, did not completely overturn medieval society. The system bent. It suffered. It adapted. Life continued. Fields were replanted. Communities recovered. Children grew into adults. Markets reopened. The routines of labor resumed. But something had changed. The crisis exposed vulnerabilities that had previously been easier to ignore. People had witnessed how fragile stability could be. And before those memories could fully fade, another challenge was approaching. To understand why the next crisis would prove so transformative, we must first appreciate how interconnected medieval labor had become. By the 14th century, Europe was not a collection of isolated villages. Trade routes connected regions. Merchants traveled considerable distances. Ships carried goods between ports. Markets linked producers and consumers across growing networks. Information moved more slowly than today, but it moved. People moved. Animals moved. Goods moved. And with movement came opportunities. Yet movement also created pathways for danger. One of history's most unsettling lessons is that systems which enable prosperity can also transmit catastrophe. The roads that carried merchants could carry disease. The ships that transported valuable cargo could transport invisible threats. The growing interconnectedness of medieval society brought benefits, but it also created new vulnerabilities. For the moment, however, most people remained focused on ordinary concerns. A carpenter worried about timber. A baker worried about grain prices. A shepherd worried about livestock. A tenant worried about rents and obligations. Life was still organized around familiar rhythms. And those rhythms deserve closer attention because they reveal another reason medieval work was so exhausting. The medieval year was not evenly demanding. Instead, it moved through periods of intense pressure followed by relative relief. This sounds preferable at first. After all, modern workers often face constant pressure. Would seasonal intensity not be easier? In practice, the answer is complicated. Periods of extreme labor create their own problems. Harvest season is the obvious example. When crops reached readiness, delays became dangerous. Entire communities mobilized. Workdays stretched. Every available hand became valuable. Children participated. Older adults contributed where possible. Neighbors cooperated. The pace accelerated because nature imposed deadlines that could not be negotiated. Rain did not wait. Grain did not wait. The season did not wait. There is an important psychological dimension to this kind of labor. Modern workers often experience pressure from managers, deadlines, or financial incentives. Medieval workers frequently experienced pressure from nature itself. Nature cannot be persuaded. Nature cannot grant extensions. The crop must be gathered when the crop is ready. This created periods of intense collective effort that could leave entire communities physically depleted. Yet these same periods often strengthened social bonds. People worked together. Meals were shared. Labor became communal. Songs accompanied repetitive tasks. Stories circulated. Knowledge passed between generations. This is one of the most fascinating contradictions of medieval work. The same labor that exhausted people could also connect them. Modern discussions sometimes assume that hard work automatically destroys community. In medieval society, communal labor often helped create it. Of course, this should not be romanticized. Cooperation existed alongside conflict. Villages contained disagreements. Families argued. Neighbors competed. People could be selfish, generous, kind, resentful, supportive, or cruel, just as they are today. The medieval village was not a harmonious paradise. It was a human community. And human communities are always complicated. Still, cooperation mattered because survival often depended upon it. This becomes especially clear when examining tasks that required collective effort. Maintaining roads, repairing bridges, managing common lands, defending resources, responding to emergencies. No single household could accomplish everything alone. The burden had to be shared. But shared burdens create another interesting form of exhaustion. Social exhaustion. The constant need to negotiate relationships. The constant awareness of obligations. The need to maintain reputation. The need to participate. The need to contribute. In small communities, social life was rarely optional. Everyone knew everyone else. Successes were visible. Failures were visible. Debts were remembered. Promises mattered. Modern people sometimes dream about escaping anonymity and living in tightly connected communities. There are genuine benefits to such communities. There are also costs. Privacy becomes limited. Expectations become powerful. Individual choices become public concerns. The medieval laborer lived within this environment every day. And because labor itself was so visible, work carried moral meaning. A diligent worker earned respect. A reliable neighbor earned trust. An idle person attracted criticism. Religious teachings often reinforced these attitudes. Work was not merely an economic activity. It was frequently understood as part of one's moral duty. This belief shaped behavior in subtle ways. The tired worker could take pride in endurance. The struggling household could interpret hardship through religious frameworks. Communities could view labor as evidence of responsibility and virtue. At the same time, these beliefs sometimes justified inequality. If social roles were seen as divinely ordered, challenging those roles became more difficult. The worker's exhaustion could be understood not as a problem requiring reform, but as a normal feature of existence. This perspective did not eliminate suffering, but it influenced how suffering was interpreted. And interpretation matters. People can endure remarkable hardship when they believe it serves a purpose. The medieval world provided many explanations for hardship. Some were spiritual, some were social, some were practical. Most people accepted a mixture of all three. Yet acceptance did not mean passivity. Throughout medieval history, workers negotiated, resisted, adapted, complained, petitioned, and sought better conditions whenever opportunities arose. This is another common misunderstanding. Peasants were not simply silent victims. Craftsmen were not merely obedient producers. Ordinary people possessed agency. Their choices mattered. Their actions shaped outcomes. Their responses influenced institutions. The balance of power often favored elites, but power was never absolute. And this fact would become increasingly important as demographic pressures, environmental instability, economic change, and social tensions continued to reshape the medieval world. The stage was gradually being set for a transformation that would alter not only how much people worked, but how labor itself was valued. For centuries, human labor had been abundant. Villages were full of workers. Fields were crowded with hands. Employers, landlords, and authorities generally assumed that labor would remain available. It was one of the foundational assumptions of medieval society. Few people imagined how dramatically that assumption could change. Yet somewhere beyond the concerns of individual villages and workshops, beyond local markets and manor courts, conditions were beginning to align in ways that would soon challenge one of the oldest economic realities in Europe, placing unprecedented importance on the very workers whose exhaustion had long been taken for granted. Yet somewhere beyond the concerns of individual villages and workshops, beyond local markets and manor courts, conditions were beginning to align in ways that would soon challenge one of the oldest economic realities in Europe, placing unprecedented importance on the very workers whose exhaustion had long been taken for granted. For centuries, labor had been abundant enough that most elites rarely questioned its availability. Lords expected fields to be worked. Monasteries expected tenants to fulfill obligations. Urban workshops expected apprentices to arrive and craftsmen to remain. The entire structure of medieval society rested upon the assumption that human effort would continue flowing upward through established channels. The assumption seemed reasonable. Europe was crowded compared to earlier centuries. Villages filled landscapes that had once been sparsely settled. Agricultural systems had expanded dramatically. Towns grew larger. Trade became more active. Human labor appeared to be everywhere. And perhaps that is why what happened next felt so shocking. Not because disease itself was unfamiliar. Medieval people lived with disease constantly. Illness was part of ordinary existence. Children died at rates that modern societies would find almost unimaginable. Infections spread easily. Medical knowledge was limited. Epidemics periodically appeared and disappeared. Disease was not new. Scale was. In the late 1340s, reports began arriving from distant regions. At first, they may have seemed like many other unsettling stories carried by merchants and travelers. News moved slowly, often distorted by distance and rumor. Something terrible was happening. Ports reported unusual mortality. Cities experienced sudden outbreaks. Communities watched healthy individuals fall ill with alarming speed. The exact path of the disease remains a subject of historical study. But what matters for our purposes is not merely where it came from. What matters is how it transformed the experience of work, exhaustion, and survival. The Black Death entered a world already carrying strain. This is important. The plague did not strike a society at perfect equilibrium. Europe had recently experienced famine, environmental instability, and demographic pressure. Many communities were still vulnerable. Then came the epidemic. For people living through it, the experience must have felt deeply disorienting. Most forms of medieval hardship followed recognizable patterns. Poor harvests had causes people understood. Harsh winters made sense. Floods could be seen. Droughts could be seen. Crop failures could be explained. The plague was different. It appeared with frightening speed. Its causes were mysterious. Its behavior seemed unpredictable. Its mortality was astonishing. And because medieval society depended so heavily upon human labor, every death carried consequences beyond personal tragedy. A field did not stop requiring cultivation because its worker died. Animals still needed care. Workshops still contained unfinished projects. Homes still required maintenance. The ordinary demands of life remained in place even as the people responsible for meeting those demands disappeared. To understand how extraordinary this was, imagine an agricultural village where a significant portion of the population suddenly vanishes within months. The fields remain, the tools remain, the obligations remain, but the workers do not. For generations, exhaustion had been produced partly because labor was abundant and expectations were high. Now a strange reversal emerged. Labor became scarce. Scarcity changed everything. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Black Death is that it transformed the value of work almost overnight. Before the plague, many laborers competed for limited opportunities and resources. After the plague, in many regions, landowners competed for workers. This shift was not immediate everywhere, nor was it uniform. Medieval Europe was far too diverse for simple generalizations. But the broader pattern was unmistakable. When a large portion of the workforce disappears, surviving workers become more valuable. The same peasant who had previously possessed limited bargaining power suddenly occupied a different position within the economic system. The The same craftsman became harder to replace. The same laborer became more necessary. This created tensions that would echo for generations. Landowners still wanted fields cultivated. Authorities still wanted stability. Governments still wanted predictable social structures. Yet economic realities were changing beneath their feet. Workers noticed. How could they not? If labor was scarce, wages could rise. If opportunities expanded, mobility became more attractive. If obligations felt burdensome, alternatives might now exist. Many surviving workers discovered that choices previously unavailable had become possible. A laborer might leave one employer for another. A tenant might negotiate more favorable conditions. A craftsman might find increased demand for specialized skills. Not everyone benefited equally, of course. The plague brought immense suffering. Entire families disappeared. Communities experienced profound grief. Economic opportunities emerged from human tragedy, and medieval people were fully aware of that uncomfortable reality. Yet history often contains such contradictions. A disaster for society can create opportunities for individuals. Catastrophe can redistribute power. The Black Death did not simply kill people. It altered relationships. Relationships between workers and employers. Relationships between tenants and landlords. Relationships between communities and institutions. And those altered relationships help explain why labor history after the plague looks different from labor history before it. Authorities quickly recognized the implications. In England, for example, efforts were made to restrict wage increases and prevent workers from demanding higher compensation. The famous Ordinance of Laborers in 1349 and the Statute of Laborers in 1351 attempted to stabilize labor conditions by limiting wages and controlling worker mobility. The very existence of such laws tells us something important. They reveal that workers possessed leverage. Governments generally do not create legislation to prevent something unless that thing is already happening. Workers were negotiating. Employers were competing. Economic realities were changing. Yet laws alone could not fully reverse demographic realities. A field missing laborers remained a field missing laborers. A workshop lacking skilled craftsmen remained short of skilled craftsmen. The plague had altered the basic arithmetic of labor. And arithmetic is stubborn. This shift produced a remarkable irony. For centuries, medieval workers had been exhausted partly because their labor was treated as abundant and replaceable. Now, after one of history's deadliest epidemics, surviving workers found themselves more economically valuable than many of their ancestors had ever been. That did not eliminate exhaustion. Far from it. In some respects, work became even more demanding. There were fewer people available to perform necessary tasks. Entire households had vanished. Communities had to reorganize. Vacant land required management. Abandoned responsibilities required reassignment. The workload did not disappear simply because workers became scarce. Instead, the burden was redistributed. This created a very different kind of labor environment. Before the plague, exhaustion often came from competition, scarcity, and obligation. After the plague, exhaustion increasingly intersected with opportunity. A laborer might work extremely hard while also recognizing that better conditions were available elsewhere. That combination could be surprisingly powerful. It encouraged movement. It encouraged negotiation. It encouraged change. Gradually, some traditional assumptions began weakening. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to matter. The medieval social order had long presented itself as natural and stable. Everyone supposedly occupied a proper place. Lords ruled. Clergy prayed. Laborers worked. Reality had always been more complicated than that idealized vision. Now it became even more complicated. Workers were discovering that scarcity gave them leverage. Landowners were discovering that authority alone could not solve every problem. Communities were adapting to new circumstances, and adaptation often produced unexpected consequences. One such consequence appeared in the countryside itself. Large areas of land no longer generated the same returns they once had. Labor-intensive agricultural practices became harder to sustain when workers were scarce and expensive. As a result, some regions shifted priorities. Pasture became more attractive than intensive cultivation. Sheep required fewer laborers than grain fields. Economic calculations changed. Land use changed. Rural landscapes changed. What appears from a distance to be a story about disease was also a story about work. Who performed it? How much it cost? Who benefited from it? Who controlled it? The plague accelerated conversations that had already been developing beneath the surface. Conversations about obligation, about wages, about rights, about expectations, and perhaps most importantly, about value. What was a worker worth? For centuries, elites often assumed they knew the answer. The post-plague world forced many of them to reconsider. The answer was suddenly higher than they preferred. Not everyone accepted this change willingly. Conflicts emerged. Tensions grew. Authorities attempted to preserve older arrangements. Workers sought greater freedom. The resulting struggles would become some of the most revealing episodes in medieval labor history, because exhaustion alone does not always produce change. People can endure hardship for generations, but exhaustion combined with new possibilities creates a different dynamic entirely. When workers believe alternatives exist, old systems become harder to maintain. A peasant who sees no alternative may tolerate burdens indefinitely. A peasant who sees opportunity begins asking different questions. The same was true in towns. Urban labor markets also changed. Skilled workers became increasingly valuable. Some trades experienced labor shortages. Wages often rose. Guild structures adapted in different ways depending on local circumstances. Opportunities expanded for certain groups, though not equally for all. Women, too, sometimes found new economic openings in the aftermath of demographic collapse, though these opportunities remained shaped by persistent social constraints. The broader pattern, however, remained clear. The balance between labor and power was shifting, and once such balances begin moving, they rarely stop immediately. The transformation unfolded over decades rather than years. One generation inherited conditions very different from those experienced by its grandparents. The old world had not vanished. Manners still existed. Lords still possessed authority. Traditional obligations still mattered. Yet beneath these familiar structures, something important had changed. Workers increasingly understood their value. Employers increasingly understood their dependence. Neither side could completely ignore the other. The relationship was becoming more negotiable, and negotiation in turn created expectations. Expectations about wages, expectations about treatment, expectations about opportunity, expectations about fairness. Those expectations would not remain quiet forever. Across different regions of Europe, they would eventually contribute to disputes, protests, and moments of remarkable social tension as ordinary laborers began testing the limits of a medieval system that had long assumed their exhaustion was simply part of the natural order of things. Across different regions of Europe, they would eventually contribute to disputes, protests, and moments of remarkable social tension as ordinary laborers began testing the limits of a medieval system that had long assumed their exhaustion was simply part of the natural order of things. One of the most revealing aspects of these tensions is that they were rarely only about money. Wages mattered, certainly. Land mattered. Taxes mattered. But beneath these practical concerns lay something deeper: control over labor itself. Who decided how work would be performed? Who determined its value? Who benefited most from it? And perhaps most importantly, who possessed the right to claim another person's time? For centuries, medieval society had answered these questions in fairly predictable ways. Authority flowed downward. Obligations flowed upward. Most people accepted this arrangement because it seemed permanent. They might complain about particular burdens, but the larger framework often appeared immovable. Yet permanence is one of history's most deceptive illusions. When people live inside a system for generations, they often mistake familiarity for inevitability. The decades following the Black Death gradually exposed the difference. Consider the perspective of a surviving laborer in the latter half of the 14th century. Perhaps his parents had spent their entire lives working under conditions where labor was plentiful and opportunities were limited. Perhaps they accepted obligations because alternatives were scarce. Perhaps they expected little change. Now imagine their son growing up in a world where employers compete for workers, where wages rise in some regions, where abandoned land becomes available, where movement becomes easier, where labor shortages create unexpected leverage. The physical work may still be exhausting. The fields are no less demanding. The weather remains unpredictable. The harvest still requires enormous effort. Yet the social meaning of that work begins to change. Exhaustion feels different when choices expand. This subtle shift helps explain many of the developments that followed. The famous peasants' revolt in England in 1381, for example, did not emerge simply because people were tired. Medieval workers had been tired for centuries. What made the late 14th century distinctive was that exhaustion increasingly collided with expectation. Workers who had experienced rising opportunities often resisted attempts to force them back into older arrangements. Governments faced difficult challenges. Tax revenues were strained. Labor markets were changing. Social structures were under pressure. Authorities sought stability. Workers sought flexibility. The resulting conflicts were complex, involving economics, politics, local grievances, and broader social tensions. Yet beneath many of these disputes lay a surprisingly simple question. If labor had become more valuable, why should workers not benefit? That question was unsettling because it challenged assumptions that had long organized medieval society. For elites, the answer was rarely straightforward. Many genuinely feared disorder. A society built upon hierarchy depends upon predictability. Rapid changes in wages, mobility, and expectations could appear threatening. What modern observers might interpret as economic negotiation often appeared to medieval authorities as a challenge to social order itself. This difference in perspective is important. Historical actors rarely see themselves as villains. Landowners worried about maintaining estates. Governments worried about stability. Church leaders worried about moral order. Workers worried about survival and opportunity. Each group interpreted events through its own concerns, and all of them remained dependent upon labor. That dependency never disappeared. In fact, it became increasingly visible. One of the quieter ironies of medieval history is that the people whose work sustained society often received the least attention in traditional narratives. Chronicles frequently focused on kings. Documents emphasized nobles. Political histories celebrated rulers and battles. Yet none of those worlds functioned without ordinary workers. A castle required masons. An army required food. A monastery required agricultural labor. A city required craftsmen. A kingdom required taxpayers. The entire structure rested upon countless individuals performing difficult work day after day. The exhaustion we have been tracing throughout this documentary was therefore not a side story. It was one of the central realities of medieval civilization. Without it, nothing else existed. And yet, even as workers gained leverage in some areas, the nature of labor itself remained physically demanding. This is an important point because it prevents us from oversimplifying the post-plague period. Higher wages did not eliminate hardship. Greater mobility did not remove uncertainty. Improved bargaining power did not create comfort. The body still faced the same basic challenges. Fields still required cultivation. Roads remained difficult. Medical care remained limited. Weather remained powerful. The medieval worker's muscles did not suddenly become less tired. What changed was the relationship between effort and reward. That distinction mattered enormously. A laborer willing to endure exhausting work often feels differently if the work produces greater security. A craftsman may accept long hours more readily when demand for skills increases. A tenant may tolerate difficult conditions if opportunities for advancement exist. Economic psychology is not exclusively modern. Medieval people also responded to incentives, possibilities, and expectations. As opportunities expanded in certain regions, new ambitions emerged. Some workers accumulated property. Some entered trades. Some improved their social standing. Some moved to towns. Others remained where they were, preferring familiarity and community to uncertainty. There was no single medieval experience. The diversity of responses reminds us that ordinary people were not passive pieces on a historical chessboard. They made decisions, sometimes cautious decisions, sometimes bold ones. Those choices gradually reshaped society from below. Meanwhile, towns continued evolving in fascinating ways. Urban life offered possibilities that differed significantly from rural existence. For many laborers, towns represented both opportunity and risk. A village might provide familiarity and support. A town offered markets, specialized trades, and economic mobility. Yet towns introduced new forms of exhaustion. The medieval craftsman did not escape hard work by moving into an urban environment. He exchanged one type of labor for another. A weaver might spend long hours bent over a loom. A smith worked amid heat, noise, and physical strain. A mason carried heavy materials and faced constant danger. A merchant traveled extensively, exposing himself to uncertainty and risk. Every occupation carried burdens. The difference lay in how those burdens were organized. Agricultural labor followed the rhythms of nature. Urban labor increasingly followed the rhythms of commerce. This shift seems subtle, but it had profound implications. Nature imposes deadlines through seasons. Commerce imposes deadlines through demand. A harvest must be completed before weather changes. An order must be completed before a customer loses patience. Both create pressure. The source of the pressure simply differs. By the late medieval period, more people found themselves navigating these commercial rhythms. Markets expanded. Trade networks grew. Economic specialization increased. The result was a society becoming gradually more interconnected. And interconnected societies create interesting forms of dependency. A village baker depended upon grain producers. A cloth merchant depended upon weavers. A weaver depended upon suppliers. A supplier depended upon transport. Each worker relied upon others. The chain could stretch surprisingly far. This growing complexity created opportunities for prosperity. It also created new vulnerabilities. When one part of the system struggled, consequences spread outward. Modern audiences often associate interconnected economies with industrial or modern periods, but many of the underlying dynamics were already visible in late medieval Europe. People increasingly participated in networks larger than their immediate communities. Their work affected strangers they would never meet. Their livelihoods depended upon decisions made elsewhere. And because labor remained central to every stage of these networks, exhaustion continued to occupy a surprisingly important place. A tired farmer produced less grain. A sick craftsman delayed production. A labor shortage disrupted supply. Human energy remained one of the most valuable resources in society. That fact shaped everything. It shaped technology. It shaped economics. It shaped politics. It even shaped architecture. Many medieval buildings that survive today are monuments not simply to wealth or faith, but to labor. Cathedrals provide an especially striking example. Visitors often admire their beauty, their height, their stained glass, their stonework, and rightly so. They are extraordinary achievements. Yet every cathedral is also a record of physical effort. Thousands upon thousands of working days. Stone cut, transported, lifted, shaped, and assembled. Timber harvested and raised. Glass produced. Metal forged. Scaffolding constructed. Repairs completed. The finished structure can make labor disappear from view. The building seems permanent. The work becomes invisible. But the medieval world was built by tired hands. In many ways, this entire documentary has been an attempt to make those hands visible again. Not merely to catalog hardship, but to understand the systems that produced it. To understand why exhaustion became normal. Why it persisted. Why people endured it. Why communities accepted it. And why, despite all of that, medieval workers continued finding ways to adapt. Adaptation is perhaps one of the most underrated themes in history. People rarely possess complete control over circumstances. What they often possess is the ability to adjust, to improvise, to negotiate, to survive. The medieval laborer did all of these things, again and again, across generations, across changing economies, across famines, epidemics, political conflicts, and shifting opportunities. That resilience deserves attention precisely because it coexisted with exhaustion. The two are not opposites. People can be extraordinarily resilient while also being profoundly tired. In fact, history suggests that many societies function because ordinary people continue working despite fatigue. Yet resilience has limits. Communities can adapt only so much. Bodies can endure only so much. Institutions can absorb only so much pressure. As the medieval period moved toward its later centuries, new developments would continue testing those limits. Economic changes accelerated. States grew more ambitious. Military demands increased in some regions. Tax systems evolved. Urban populations expanded. Trade networks reached farther. The world was becoming more complex. And complexity often creates new forms of work. Not necessarily more work in every case, but different work, additional responsibilities, new expectations, fresh demands on time and energy. For workers already carrying centuries of accumulated obligations, these transformations opened another chapter in the story of labor. A chapter in which exhaustion would increasingly intersect with emerging forms of opportunity, ambition, and economic change, as Europe continued moving toward a future that would look surprisingly unfamiliar to many of the people who had spent their lives sustaining the medieval world with their own effort. For workers already carrying centuries of accumulated obligations, these transformations opened another chapter in the story of labor. A chapter in which exhaustion would increasingly intersect with emerging forms of opportunity, ambition, and economic change, as Europe continued moving toward a future that would look surprisingly unfamiliar to many of the people who had spent their lives sustaining the medieval world with their own effort. One of the more surprising realities of late medieval labor is that greater opportunity did not necessarily lead to less work. Modern listeners often imagine that increased bargaining power automatically produces easier lives. Yet history is rarely that straightforward. In many regions, workers who gained access to better wages or improved conditions often responded by pursuing goals that had previously been beyond reach. A family that once struggled merely to survive might now seek a more secure tenancy. A craftsman might aspire to become a master. A merchant might expand operations. A laborer might acquire land. Each new possibility brought new responsibilities. The physical burden of work remained, but the purpose behind that work began to evolve. This subtle shift is easy to miss when discussing medieval exhaustion. For much of the earlier Middle Ages, labor often centered on maintaining stability. The goal was survival. The objective was continuity. Families worked to preserve what they already possessed. Increasingly, however, some people found themselves working toward advancement. That difference mattered psychologically. A difficult day feels different when it contributes to a future that seems attainable. The body still aches. The muscles still tire. Yet the relationship between effort and expectation changes. Not everyone experienced this transformation equally, of course. Large portions of the population remained vulnerable. Regional differences remained enormous. Some communities benefited far more than others. But across broad areas of Europe, opportunities that had once seemed improbable gradually became imaginable. And imagination can be historically powerful. When people begin imagining different futures, they often begin questioning old assumptions. One such assumption concerned social mobility itself. For generations, medieval society had promoted the idea that most people should remain within the station into which they were born. Reality had never perfectly matched this ideal. Movement between social positions always existed to some degree. Successful merchants rose. Skilled craftsmen prospered. Clerics advanced through church institutions. Yet the traditional image of a stable social hierarchy remained influential. The post-plague world complicated that image. Labor shortages increased the value of skilled workers. Economic changes created new opportunities. Growing towns offered alternatives to village life. Trade connected individuals to wider markets. As a result, more people encountered situations that challenged inherited expectations. This development helps explain why authorities often seemed anxious about maintaining social distinctions. The concern was not merely symbolic. Status carried practical consequences. Clothing regulations, guild restrictions, property rights, and legal privileges all reflected efforts to define who belonged where within society. When economic changes blurred those boundaries, tensions naturally followed. Interestingly, some of the most revealing evidence comes from attempts to regulate appearance. Various medieval governments introduced sumptuary laws intended to restrict what different social groups could wear. These laws are often remembered as curious historical details, but they tell us something important. People were becoming difficult to categorize. If authorities felt the need to specify who could wear certain fabrics, colors, or decorations, it suggests that economic reality was beginning to challenge traditional visual markers of status. In other words, workers who had once been easily distinguishable from elites were sometimes accumulating enough wealth to imitate aspects of elite consumption. That did not mean medieval society suddenly became equal. Far from it. Inequality remained substantial, but it does remind us that labor could occasionally translate into visible improvement. And visible improvement often encouraged further effort. This brings us to another aspect of exhaustion that deserves attention. Aspiration. Histories of labor frequently emphasize coercion, necessity, and hardship. Those elements were certainly present. Yet many medieval people also worked because they hoped to achieve something, to purchase land, to establish a workshop, to provide for children, to secure a marriage, to improve household stability, to avoid future vulnerability. These goals do not eliminate hardship, but they help explain why people often endured extraordinary demands. Work was not only imposed from above, it was also driven by ambitions from below. The medieval worker could simultaneously resent exhausting obligations and pursue exhausting opportunities. Human motivations are rarely simple. This complexity becomes especially clear in towns, where economic life grew increasingly sophisticated. By the 15th century, many urban centers displayed levels of specialization that would surprise those who imagined medieval economies as primitive. Crafts became highly organized. Markets expanded. Financial practices evolved. Commercial networks stretched across impressive distances. All of this depended upon labor, not abstract labor, but actual people performing highly specific tasks. The production of cloth offers an excellent example. A single piece of finished cloth represented the combined effort of numerous workers. Wool had to be produced. Fibers had to be cleaned. Thread had to be spun. Material had to be woven. Cloth had to be finished, dyed, transported, and sold. Each stage required skill. Each stage required time. Each stage created opportunities for fatigue. Yet the finished product concealed much of that effort. The customer saw cloth. The labor disappeared from view. This pattern occurred throughout medieval economies. Finished goods often obscured the exhausting processes behind them. A pair of shoes represented countless actions. A metal tool reflected hours of skilled work. A loaf of bread embodied months of agricultural labor. The medieval world was filled with hidden effort. And because so much labor remained invisible, it is easy for modern observers to underestimate its scale. We tend to notice dramatic work. We notice the construction of cathedrals. We notice military campaigns. We notice major engineering projects. What we overlook are the repetitive tasks that consumed most people's lives. The endless carrying, the endless lifting, the endless cleaning, the endless maintenance, the endless repair. These activities rarely appear in traditional historical narratives because they produced few spectacular events. Yet they shaped daily experience far more than kings or battles did. Imagine a medieval household during an ordinary week. Not a week marked by famine or plague. Not a week of political crisis. Just an ordinary week. Water must be obtained repeatedly. Fuel must be gathered. Meals must be prepared. Animals must be monitored. Clothing must be maintained. Tools must be repaired. Waste must be managed. Food must be stored. Children must be supervised. Fields, gardens, workshops, or businesses require attention. Almost none of these tasks occur once. They repeat. That repetition is crucial. Human beings can often tolerate extraordinary effort for short periods. What wears people down is repetition. The medieval world was built upon repetition. The same tasks returned day after day, season after season, generation after generation. The cycle itself became a source of exhaustion. Yet repetition also produced competence. The experienced worker developed routines. The experienced household developed systems. Communities accumulated practical knowledge. Over time, people learned how to manage labor more efficiently. This practical wisdom represented one of the greatest strengths of medieval society. A modern observer might possess access to advanced technology, but a medieval farmer often understood local soil conditions with extraordinary precision. A medieval shepherd knew animal behavior intimately. A skilled craft worker mastered techniques requiring years of disciplined practice. These forms of expertise emerged through repetition. And repetition once again carried a price. Skill and exhaustion frequently developed together. The most experienced workers often bore the marks of long labor. Their knowledge was embodied. Literally, Their hands reflected their work. Their posture reflected their work. Their joints reflected their work. The body became a historical document. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains repeatedly encounter evidence of repetitive physical strain. These findings remind us that labor was not merely an economic category. It was a biological experience. The body adapted. The body endured. The body paid costs. And while we often focus on physical consequences, mental fatigue existed as well. Medieval people did not use modern terms such as burnout, but that does not mean they lacked emotional strain. Responsibility can be exhausting in any era. Uncertainty can be exhausting in any era. Worry can be exhausting in any era. A household head concerned about harvest outcomes experienced genuine psychological pressure. A merchant awaiting the arrival of goods experienced uncertainty. A craftsman concerned about debt experienced stress. Human emotional responses did not suddenly appear in the modern world. What differed were the frameworks used to understand them. Religion often played a significant role in this regard. Faith provided explanations for suffering, provided rituals, provided community, provided hope. These functions mattered enormously in societies where uncertainty remained a constant companion. A modern listener might underestimate the practical importance of religious life because it is often discussed primarily in spiritual terms. Yet medieval religion also helped people cope with labor itself. Holy days interrupted work routines. Festivals provided communal experiences. Rituals marked the passage of time. Religious narratives offered meaning. Even the church bells that punctuated daily life contributed to a sense of order. Order matters when life feels uncertain. The medieval worker often lived within a world where many outcomes remained beyond individual control. Weather could not be commanded. Disease could not be fully prevented. Markets could not always be predicted. Political decisions could arrive unexpectedly. Religion offered a framework through which uncertainty became more manageable. This does not mean all workers found comfort in the same ways. People varied enormously. Some were deeply devout. Others may have been skeptical. Most likely occupied positions somewhere between complete certainty and complete doubt. What matters historically is that religious institutions formed part of the larger system through which labor was understood. Work was not merely economic. It was moral, social, spiritual, communal. The result was a society in which exhaustion carried meanings beyond physical fatigue. A difficult harvest could become evidence of perseverance. Hard work could become evidence of virtue. Endurance could become a source of dignity. These interpretations did not remove hardship, but they shaped how people lived with it. And living with hardship remained one of the defining challenges of medieval existence. Even as economic opportunities expanded in some regions, even as labor gained value, even as social mobility became somewhat more attainable for certain groups, the basic reality remained unchanged. Life required work, an extraordinary amount of it. The medieval world never discovered a way to escape that fact. What changed over time were the systems through which work was organized, rewarded, justified, and controlled. Those systems continued evolving throughout the later medieval centuries. Governments grew more sophisticated. Commercial networks expanded further. Urban economies became increasingly complex. New opportunities emerged. New pressures emerged alongside them. And as these developments accelerated, they began laying foundations for transformations that would eventually carry Europe beyond the medieval world itself, into an age where labor would become connected to expanding states, growing markets, and new forms of economic organization that were already beginning to take shape beneath the familiar rhythms of village fields, town workshops, and the tired but indispensable hands that still kept them running. And as these developments accelerated, they began laying foundations for transformations that would eventually carry Europe beyond the medieval world itself, into an age where labor would become connected to expanding states, growing markets, and new forms of economic organization that were already beginning to take shape beneath the familiar rhythms of village fields, town workshops, and the tired but indispensable hands that still kept them running. What makes this transition particularly fascinating is that most people living through it would not have recognized it as a transition at all. A farmer rising before sunrise in the early 15th century still encountered many of the same realities that had shaped the lives of ancestors centuries earlier. The weather still mattered. Harvests still mattered. Animals still mattered. Physical endurance remained one of the most valuable human qualities. And yet the world surrounding that farmer was changing in ways that were subtle enough to be almost invisible. The medieval period is often imagined as static, but in truth it was remarkably dynamic. Technologies improved, trade routes shifted, political authority expanded and contracted, economic relationships evolved, new ideas circulated, populations rose and fell. The challenge for historians is that these changes often unfolded slowly. People rarely wake up and discover they are living in a new age. Instead, generations inherit slightly different worlds from their parents. The differences accumulate. Only later do they become obvious. One of those accumulating differences involved the growing role of money. Throughout much of medieval history, obligations had often been expressed through labor services, rents in kind, and customary duties. Peasant might owe work on a lord's land. A tenant might provide agricultural products. A household might fulfill responsibilities through direct labor rather than financial payment. Gradually, in many regions, money became increasingly important. This shift did not happen everywhere at the same speed. Europe remained enormously diverse. Yet over time, more obligations became monetized. More transactions involved currency. More economic relationships depended upon cash payments. At first glance, this might seem like a technical change. In reality, it altered the experience of work itself. When obligations are measured through labor, people primarily worry about time and effort. When obligations are measured through money, people begin worrying about earnings, prices, and markets. The physical labor remains, but new concerns appear alongside it. A worker must now think not only about producing enough, but also about selling enough. A household must consider market conditions. A craftsman becomes increasingly sensitive to demand. Economic uncertainty acquires new dimensions. The result was not less exhaustion. Rather, it was a different mixture of exhaustion. Physical strain remained central. Economic calculation became increasingly important as well. The growing importance of markets created another intriguing development. For much of medieval history, many workers had been closely tied to local conditions. Their lives revolved around nearby villages, nearby fields, nearby customers, and nearby obligations. As commercial networks expanded, more people became connected to distant events. A merchant in one town might depend upon conditions hundreds of miles away. A weaver's livelihood could be affected by international demand. Political decisions made by rulers might influence local economies in unexpected ways. The medieval worker increasingly occupied a larger world. Not necessarily a better world, not necessarily a worse one, but certainly a larger one. This expansion created opportunities. It also created uncertainty. The relationship between opportunity and uncertainty appears repeatedly throughout labor history. The two often grow together. A larger market creates more possibilities. It also creates more competition. A broader economy creates new sources of wealth. It also creates new forms of vulnerability. People rarely receive one without the other. This is especially apparent when examining the growth of long-distance trade. Merchants connected regions that previously interacted only sporadically. Goods moved farther. Information traveled more widely. Specialized industries emerged in certain locations. All of these developments depended upon workers. Someone had to produce the goods. Someone had to transport them. Someone had to maintain infrastructure. Someone had to build ships. Someone had to repair roads. Someone had to manage warehouses. The expansion of commerce rested upon enormous quantities of labor. Much of that labor remains invisible in traditional historical narratives. We remember famous merchants. We remember rulers who promoted trade. We remember wealthy cities. Less often do we remember the porters carrying cargo, the sailors enduring long voyages, the laborers loading ships, the craftsmen producing goods. Yet these workers formed the foundation of economic expansion, and many of them lived physically demanding lives. Consider the medieval dock worker. His labor differed dramatically from that of a peasant farmer, yet exhaustion remained a familiar companion. Heavy cargo required lifting. Ships required maintenance. Weather remained unpredictable. Injuries were common. Employment could be uncertain. The environment differed. The strain persisted. Or consider miners. Mining expanded in importance throughout parts of late medieval Europe. Metals were increasingly valuable. Economic growth encouraged extraction. Mining work could be extraordinarily difficult. Darkness, confined spaces, dangerous conditions, physical exertion. The medieval miner occupied a very different world from the village farmer, yet both shared a common reality. Survival depended upon labor performed under challenging circumstances. This diversity of experience reminds us that there was never a single medieval worker. There were countless medieval workers: farmers, shepherds, masons, millers, carpenters, bakers, brewers, fishermen, sailors, servants, merchants, weavers, miners, blacksmiths. Each occupation carried unique demands. Each produced unique forms of fatigue, yet certain themes united them: uncertainty, physical effort, dependence upon broader systems, the constant need to balance immediate survival against future security. Another aspect that deserves attention is the role of family labor. Modern economies often separate work and family more sharply than medieval societies did. In many medieval households, economic activity was a collective endeavor. Family members worked together. Responsibilities overlapped. Skills passed between generations. Children learned through participation rather than formal instruction alone. This arrangement produced efficiencies. It also produced pressures. A household's success depended upon cooperation. The illness of one member affected everyone. The productivity of one member benefited everyone. Individual effort became deeply interconnected. The family functioned not merely as a social unit, but as an economic one. This reality helps explain why demographic shocks could be so devastating. The loss of a single worker represented more than personal tragedy. It altered the household's productive capacity. It changed calculations. It disrupted routines. It increased burdens for those who remained. The economic and emotional consequences often arrive together. This intertwining of labor and family also shaped attitudes toward age. Children gradually entered productive roles. Adults carried the heaviest responsibilities. Older individuals contributed knowledge, experience, and often continued working long after modern retirement ages. The concept of a lengthy retirement would have seemed unfamiliar to most medieval workers. People generally continued contributing as long as circumstances allowed. Labor was not a phase of life. It was life. This reality contributed significantly to long-term exhaustion. Modern people often think of work in terms of careers, Medieval people more often experienced work as an enduring condition of existence. There was no sharp dividing line between working life and ordinary life because the two were largely identical. The field was part of life. The workshop was part of life. The household was part of life. The labor required to sustain them all flowed continuously. And yet, despite this constant effort, medieval workers were not merely surviving machines. They found moments of enjoyment, moments of celebration, moments of leisure. This is another area where popular imagination sometimes becomes distorted. Acknowledging exhaustion does not require portraying medieval people as permanently miserable. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. They create joy even under difficult conditions. Festivals mattered. Music mattered. Storytelling mattered. Community gatherings mattered. Shared meals mattered. These experiences offered relief not because work disappeared, but because life contained more than work. Indeed, some of the strongest social bonds formed precisely because people worked together. Shared labor created shared experience. Neighbors remembered difficult harvests. Families remembered collective achievements. Communities built identities around cooperation. The same labor that exhausted people could also connect them. History often contains these kinds of contradictions. The field could be a source of hardship and belonging. The workshop could be a source of pressure and pride. The village could impose obligations while offering support. Understanding medieval labor requires holding these contradictions simultaneously. The world was neither entirely oppressive nor comfortably idyllic. It was complicated, like most human societies. This complexity becomes especially visible when we examine attitudes toward productivity. Modern cultures often celebrate constant improvement, efficiency, and growth. Medieval people certainly valued hard work, but many also understood limits in ways that feel surprisingly different from modern assumptions. Seasonal rhythms imposed natural boundaries. Religious calendars imposed pauses. Agricultural cycles encouraged periods of intense activity followed by periods of relative recovery. The pace could be brutal at certain times of year, yet it was not always uniform. This distinction is important because it highlights one of the major differences between medieval and later forms of labor organization. The medieval worker was often governed by nature's schedule. The worker of later centuries would increasingly be governed by commercial schedules, administrative schedules, and eventually industrial schedules. The transition was gradual, but its implications were profound. Nature can be demanding. Markets can be demanding. Factories can be demanding. Yet they demand different things. The medieval workers' exhaustion emerged primarily from physical necessity and environmental uncertainty. Future workers would increasingly encounter additional forms of pressure linked to time discipline, market competition, and institutional control. In that sense, the story we have been following is not merely about why medieval work left people exhausted. It is also about the changing meaning of exhaustion itself, what people worked for, how they understood work, who controlled work, and how economic systems shaped daily life. By the late medieval period, many of the foundations of older labor arrangements remained intact. Villages still cultivated fields. Craftsmen still practiced trades. Families still organized production around households. Yet beneath these familiar structures, larger forces continued gathering strength. States sought greater revenues. Merchants pursued wider markets. Urban centers expanded their influence. Technologies continued evolving. Economic relationships grew increasingly complex. The medieval worker standing at the edge of this changing world could not fully see where these developments would lead. But the signs were already present. The old rhythms persisted. The new rhythms were beginning to emerge. And somewhere between them stood millions of ordinary people whose daily labor would continue shaping the course of European history as the balance between tradition and transformation moved steadily forward into the centuries ahead. And somewhere between them stood millions of ordinary people whose daily labor would continue shaping the course of European history as the balance between tradition and transformation moved steadily forward into the centuries ahead. When people imagine the medieval world today, they often remember its most visible symbols. They remember castles rising above the landscape. They remember armored knights. They remember kings, queens, cathedrals, battles, and famous names preserved in chronicles. Yet if we step back and look at the medieval centuries as a whole, a different picture gradually comes into focus. Beneath every castle stood laborers. Beneath every kingdom stood workers. Beneath every cathedral stood generations of hands that cut stone, carried timber, forged metal, baked bread, tended animals, spun thread, repaired tools, and cultivated fields. The medieval world was built not only by power, but by effort. And that effort was often exhausting, not because medieval people were weaker than we are, not because they lacked intelligence, not because they failed to organize their societies. Rather, because they lived in a world where survival demanded an extraordinary amount of human energy. Their tools were limited. Their safety nets were fragile. Their dependence on weather was immense. Their bodies served as the primary engines of production. Almost everything required labor. Food required labor. Clothing required labor. Shelter required labor. Transport required labor. Warmth required labor. Even many forms of leisure depended upon work completed beforehand. The simple comforts that modern people often take for granted were, for medieval families, the end result of countless hours of effort. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson is that medieval exhaustion was never merely physical. It was social, economic, emotional, sometimes spiritual. People carried responsibilities that extended beyond themselves. They worked for households, for communities, for obligations inherited from previous generations, for children who would inherit what came next. The tiredness they experienced was often the tiredness of sustaining an entire way of life. That is why the story cannot be reduced to misery. The medieval world contained hardship, certainly. There was hunger, disease, cold, uncertainty, backbreaking labor, but there was also resilience, community, skill, knowledge, adaptation. People laughed, celebrated, married, raised families, shared stories beside fires, marked holy days, helped neighbors, found meaning in routines that outsiders might view only as burdens. A trustworthy understanding of history requires holding both realities together. The work was exhausting. The lives were still human. And perhaps that is the deeper reason this topic continues to fascinate people centuries later. Because when we look closely enough, medieval workers stop feeling like distant historical figures. Their tools were different. Their beliefs were different. Their world was different. Yet many of their concerns remain strangely familiar. The worry that there is always more work waiting tomorrow. The fear that one bad season could undo months of effort. The hope that hard work might create a better future for one's family. The desire for stability. The search for dignity. The challenge of balancing obligation and freedom. These experiences cross centuries remarkably well. The details change. The technologies change. The economies change. But the human questions often remain. And so, when we ask why medieval work left people constantly exhausted, the answer turns out to be larger than any single field, workshop, manor, or village. People were exhausted because they carried the weight of a world that depended upon their labor at almost every level. They were exhausted because survival demanded persistence, because nature imposed deadlines, because institutions imposed obligations, because uncertainty never completely disappeared, because every loaf of bread, every repaired roof, every harvested field, every finished garment, and every functioning community required effort from ordinary people whose names history rarely recorded. Yet those unnamed people shaped the medieval world more than anyone else. Kings could issue commands, lords could claim authority, merchants could accumulate wealth, churches could ring their bells across the countryside. But none of it functioned without workers. The tired hands in the fields, the tired hands in the workshops, the tired hands carrying water, gathering fuel, tending livestock, repairing tools, baking bread, weaving cloth, and keeping households alive. Their labor rarely became famous, yet it endured, generation after generation, century after century. And in the quiet rhythm of that labor lies one of the most important truths about medieval history. Civilizations are not sustained primarily by extraordinary moments. They are sustained by ordinary people doing difficult things repeatedly, often without recognition, often without certainty, often while exhausted. As the medieval world gradually gave way to new eras, new economies, and new ways of organizing work, many things changed. But the legacy of those workers remained embedded in the landscapes they cultivated, the towns they built, the institutions they sustained, and the societies they helped create. The next time you picture medieval Europe, it may be worth looking beyond the castle walls and royal courts for a moment. Look instead toward the fields at dawn, toward the workshop before sunrise, toward the household preparing for another day, toward the countless ordinary people whose effort made the extraordinary possible. And perhaps ask yourself this: what part of their world would have felt hardest to endure? Not for a day, not for a season, but for an entire lifetime. Whatever your answer, it is likely that somewhere within it you will find the same thing medieval workers knew all too well: that history is often carried forward by people who are far more tired than the records remember. And on countless mornings across the medieval centuries, they rose anyway,